Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sim Kern, pronouns they, them. I'm an author, a journalist, a booktuber, bookstagrammer, all those things. And today I'm going to be talking about what I read in January. You know, one of my resolutions for 2022 is to try to add content to this channel more regularly. And because when I am doing it more regularly, I end up reading more. So I'm going to start with the January wrap up. I am going to be reading a lot more YA this year, so I'm excited about that because I'm writing the sequel to my YA debut, which is coming out November 1st of 2022, Seeds for the Swarm. So that's coming out this November, and I'm writing Rules for the Reckoning, which will come out next November from Stelliform Press. So I need to be reading YA sci-fi to get myself in that mind space and get inspiration. I ended up reading all books with red covers. And it started out just, I read the first two and they both had red covers. And then I thought, let's just keep it going. Why not? I had the others that I bought and were sitting on my TBR shelf. I've never done a color themed reading book, but I actually kind of like it. It made me want to read more. It made me want to read all the red books that I had on my TBR shelf. And I think it kind of pushed me to do that further. So maybe, I don't know, let me know in the comments. Do you think I should keep it going? Should I do all orange books in February? Maybe that's a good way to stay motivated. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the books in the reverse order that I read them, just because that's how I feel like doing it. So what I'm reading right now, and I'm almost done with it, but I feel like I can talk on it because it's a book of poetry. I'm reading Rifqa by Mohammed el-Kurd. And if you don't know Mohammed el-Kurd, he's a Palestinian journalist, poet, activist. You should definitely follow him on Twitter, on Instagram. And he is such a powerful voice right now for the Palestinian youth activist movement. I've learned so much from following his social media accounts. This was my first time reading his poetry. It's incredibly powerful. It's very accessible. I don't read a whole lot of poetry, and a lot of times reading poetry makes me feel like I'm not smart enough to read poetry. But I found these poems really easy to understand. Even if you don't know a lot about the situation in Palestine or Palestinian history, he actually includes footnotes with defining important events and things that you would need to know to understand some of the context of the poems. And if you haven't ever read any Palestinian literature or really know much about the situation at all, I think actually this book of poetry could be a good way into the Palestinian perspective. Rifqa is the name of el-Kurd's grandmother, and there's a longer poem that is kind of telling her life story in this book, which is very powerful. All of the poems are very powerful. They are certainly dealing with a lot of serious, heavy topics that are the day-to-day reality of Palestinians. A lot of death and violence, and that's what goes hand in hand with ethnic cleansing that's happening in Palestine. So some of you may remember last summer, me and a couple other YouTubers, we did the Palestine Reading Challenge, and I was actually saving this book. I want to do it again this year, and I was kind of saving this book for it. But because they had a red cover, I was like, I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to read one more red book in January. And I'm so glad I did, because now I get to spend all year 2022 hitting people over the head with this book and telling them that they need to read it, because we really should be supporting Palestinian authors. We should be communicating to publishing that we want more Palestinian perspectives. And we really need to support Mohammed el-Kurd because his work is just incredible in all the spaces and all the ways that he writes. The book I read before that was Persephone Station by Stina Light. I met Stina at ArmadilloCon this year, which is a science fiction writing convention in Austin, Texas. And I think Stina is from Austin. And first of all, I just really liked their whole thing. Stina uses she, them pronouns, so I might use them interchangeably. Stina and I were on a panel together about hope punk, and writing that's speculative writing that's more optimistic than dystopian. And then also we were on a panel about writing non-binary characters together. Stina themselves is also non-binary. so I knew I wanted to read this book, Persephone Station, and I actually bought it right after Armadillo Con, which was back in October, but I didn't get a chance to read it until now. It's very big, so I was waiting for, you know, a time that I would have the time to tackle it. So this is kind of outside what I normally read. It's space opera, and it's also got kind of like film noir feelings, especially the first third of the novel has a really like film noir kind of vibe. Those aren't genre, and it's also kind of, the sci-fi is more military sci-fi, I would say. Those aren't things that I usually read. The science fiction I tend to gravitate towards is more like Ursula K. Le Guin, very high concept, very philosophical. But I did enjoy this book. The military scenes, some of it, there was a good chunk of the book that was like a lot of battles and fighting, and I'll be honest, I get terribly bored. Like, it doesn't matter. I'm sure she's writing it really well. Like, but it's just, if people are shooting guns, I just instantly get bored. Any movie, any show, anything, anywhere. I don't care if it's blasters or rocket launches or anything, I get really bored. So that's not for me, but if it's for you, I think you'll really love it. And there was a lot to love in this book for me as well. One of the plot lines that I really loved is one of the characters is an AI who has downloaded herself into a human body, which I think that's a cool twist on that trope, because oftentimes we have like the AI where, you know, humans created it, humans gave it life, like Commander Data or Edward Scissorhands. I think it's an interesting twist on that trope that Kennedy Lou, the character in this book, is an AI who took it upon herself to get herself into a body. And there are AIs that have, you know, created their own sort of consciousness by absorbing other AIs. So I thought that was really cool. The world building was all really interesting to me. I wasn't very optimistic, which surprised me because of the Hope Punk panel we were on together where she mentioned this book. But I do think by the end of the book, it's definitely like a trend towards more like hopeful. The movement of the plot is towards a better, more hopeful outlook. You know, it's an interplanetary society, but it's very corporate controlled. And there are AIs that control these corporations, but the AIs aren't necessarily the evil bad guys. So I thought that was interesting. There's also like a found family of like queer, many of them non-binary characters in the book who form this like mercenary team that's hired to save this sort of indigenous like life forms from the Corpo State's attack. The non-binary representation is not perfect, but I think that Stina actually came out as non-binary after this book was published. And again, I just think it's so important that there's space for authors to like learn and make mistakes as they're growing into like queer writing. So just like for one example, there's like one part of the book where there's like three characters walking up and the perspective character says like there was a man and a woman and a non-binary person walked up. And it's like, well, you know, a non-binary person walked into the bar. You can't tell on site if someone's non-binary. Someone, you know, non-binary comes in all the different gender presentations. It's outside the gender binary. So in the book, non-binary is kind of used as like third gender or used interchangeably with androgynous, which is not what non-binary means. But I did notice on Stina's website that she had a statement that she had like heard this criticism and learned from it, and she was growing and she appreciated it. So again, I think we need to give authors that grace to write and sometimes make mistakes and find themselves. And I'm not going to like toss out this entire book because the non-binary representation wasn't 100% perfect. And especially having been on that panel with Stina about not writing non-binary characters, Stina was talking about like through the process of writing this book, they figured out that they were non-binary and they're leaning into using, you know, started using they, them pronouns and started feeling more comfortable with they, them pronouns. And so I even though the non-binary rep isn't perfect, I enjoy the non-binary characters in here. And I definitely think if that all that description sounds cool to you, you should check out Persephone Station. Okay, the third book ago that I read was Iron Widow. Oh my God, I loved this book. Ugh. It made me fall back in love with YA. Honestly, true story. Since I finished writing my young adult book and I was querying it for a year, and then my agent left and I had to get another agent, and then I was on sub for a year, I have not been reading YA because I have just been too jealous, honestly, or like it's just been too fraught for me, because my YA, it was like, is it going to get published or not? And so that whole time, if I read a YA book and I loved it, I'd be like, shit, this is so good. I can never write this good. I'll never make it. And then if I read a YA book that I didn't really like, I'd be like, this got published and I'm getting rejections. Like, what the fuck? So, so I haven't been able to read YA for 2 years, but now that my young adult trilogy has sold and I have a young adult book coming out this year and I'm writing another young adult book, I want to be reading a lot of YA. And this was the book to make me fall back in love with it. I've never read anything like this. This is it is such a fun romp. So it's about, if you haven't heard, everyone's been talking about this book. Do I need to tell you what it's about? It's about mech pilots, okay? And I'm not a fan of the mech pilot genre, but Xiran Zhao's writing is just like so exciting. Grabs you in the plot. She's like, come here. You're in this story now. I loved that this book was so unapologetically angry. And, you know, anger coming from a woman in a really unapologetic way. It freed me up reading this book. It also has an unapologetic, polyamorous, true love triangle that gets resolved. I shouldn't do spoilers, but it's a great turn on the love triangle trope, and it's great polyamorous representation, I think. So those two aspects of the book really just like, I feel like freed me. As I'm now sitting down to write Rules for the Reckoning, I'm like, I can be as angry as I want with this book, and I can go big with this book, and I'm feeling very inspired that like YA is fantasy. All YA is fantasy. It's about power fantasy, right? Like YA sci-fi and fantasy. YA speculative fiction. It's all fantasy in that it's like a power fantasy, and then it's like all these books are about young people having way more power to change things than they would than they do in the real world. The Iron Widow, like, and I forget her name. It was like 2 weeks ago, so names are already gone. That's just how I am with books. So much power to change the world, and just leaned into the idea of this power fantasy completely, and that's kind of what I want to do with Rules for the Reckoning. And I feel like really freed up by this book to just make it the anarchist fantasy of my dreams. I'm so excited about it. Anyway, so I don't give star ratings on books anymore, but this one would be like 15 stars probably. Okay. The first book I read in January was for my book club of teachers and librarians that I associate with here in Houston. I've been in this book club for like 8 years or something at this point. So that's my IRL book club. And it was not a book that I chose. And I read the whole thing. I've been like being not as good on reading their picks because of all this booktubing stuff I'm doing now and how many books I have to read for research or my work, or I got to blurb someone, I got to review something, you know. So I actually read the whole thing, and then we got sick and we didn't know if it was COVID. And so and then it wasn't COVID, but I didn't get to go to the meeting, which I was really sad about. But anyways, we read The Red Tent by Anita Diamant. This was a super popular, it's now a Lifetime miniseries. I mean, you've heard of this book. This was a super popular book club book when it came out in the 90s. Yes, 97. And I think this book club that I'm in has been running for over 20 years, I think. I'm like a newcomer to it. So they read this book in the 90s, I think, and now, or in the early 2000s. And now they were doing like a reread to see 10 years later, what do they think? Or 20 years later. I don't know how long ago they read it. Anyways, I can see why this was like a super popular book in the 90s. I mean, it's very well written. So it tells the story, it takes a character from the Bible, Dinah, who was one of Jacob's many children, his only daughter. and tells her life story. So it's just sort of taking the few little bits about her life that there are in the Bible, and it's a really tragic story, the Bible version, and makes her this whole life. And you really feel like you're there. I mean, I think Diamant does a great job creating a sense of place and making you feel like you're in this biblical time and this biblical landscape and all of that. The relationships between the mothers and daughters, also the description of like functional polyamory among Jacob's wives is like pretty cool, and very well realized. You really feel like you're there. You really can get lost in the story. The only thing that there's something about it that makes me feel a little yucky, which is just because the author, Anita Diamant, is like, she writes also books about like contemporary Jewish living and stuff. And it just makes me so wary of like Zionist propaganda. And I'm not saying this is Zionist propaganda, but the obsession with Israel, just as someone who's like very involved in the anti-Zionist movement and supporting Palestinian liberation, it feels kind of gross to me. And it just feels like, move on. So Diamant is writing, fictionalizing this story from the Torah. And I get that impulse, but it's just so political to, as a white American Jew, write this story placing yourself in this landscape that you're not in. And I get that it was different. She was writing in the 90s, but it wasn't different because Israeli apartheid was happening in the 90s as well. And I'm worried that like books like this give white American Jews a feeling of ownership and belonging to a land that is not theirs and that is and has been occupied by Palestinians for many, many centuries. So that's the only thing about this book. And I don't know if that's like a fair criticism, but it's just like as I was reading it, like a kind of response, and it's why I haven't read it, even though I've known it's been this really popular book. I've known it's been out there for 20 years and everybody loves it. But I just kind of think I was avoiding it for that reason. I don't know if Anita Diamant is a Zionist or not. I didn't look into it too much. I did like go to her Twitter and just kind of poke around a little bit, but I didn't see anything in like a 3-minute search, but I didn't really go down that rabbit hole because I was going to read it anyways, because it was the book club pick. But then I didn't get to go to the book club. C'est la vie. Next month, what I know I'm reading for sure, so our climate fiction book club pick I still have to read, February 6th is going to be our live show discussing My Year of Meats by Ruth Ozeki, which I'm really excited about reading. That's what I'm going to be reading this week. After that, I also know my in-person IRL book club is one of the women chose Louise Erdrich's The Scented, so we're reading that for sure. Other than that, I need to read another YA sci-fi or fantasy book, so please recommend me your favorite YA sci-fi fantasy books, especially ones that have come out in the last 2 years, since I have not been reading them the last 2 years. What are you reading in February? What did you read in January? Let me know in the comments. And that's it for me. I'll see you next time. Next Sunday, I'll have the Cli-Fi book club. It's not gonna be on my channel. It's on Will's channel, Life Goofer. So check that out. See you then. Subscribe, like, all those things. Bye.